Welcome to Education Talks. I'm David Burke. Dr. Michael Berry is an experienced school leader and education professional currently serving as the head of school at Bandung Independent School in Indonesia. With a career spanning almost 3 decades in international school settings and a Doctorate of Education focused in educational leadership, I was keen to chat with him about what makes a good school and what shapes a good school leader. Well, Dr. Michael Berry, welcome to Education Talks.
Thank you, Dave. It's very, very exciting to be here. Thanks for having me along. Appreciate it.
It's an honor to have you on the show. Where are you joining us from?
Right now, I'm at my school, Bandung Independent School in Bandung, Indonesia. We're located about 150 kilometers southeast of Jakarta. So on a good day in traffic, I can get from Jakarta here in about 2.5 hours. On a bad day, well, much longer.
So you're the head of school. Can you tell us a little bit about your role in the school?
Yeah. I would. My role in the school has changed over the past couple of years. So when I took over the head of school position, it was right during the beginning of the pandemic. And in fact, I was in Singapore before I came to Indonesia. I couldn't get into Indonesia due to the borders being closed. I extended my visa in Singapore as long as I could. And finally, Singapore said, Michael, you need to go. So I went to the States and I was working online from the States. And my role at that point, and I did that for about 4 months before I was able to get into Indonesia. But my role at that point, and I'll be quite honest with you, was just to get the school through the pandemic. I'm sure that every other educator in the world had, dealt with trials and tribulations of the pandemic. But just getting the school from where we were then to where we are now, all the while losing student after student, it was literally, a day-to-day operation of, what's going to happen now. We were online or hybrid learning for about 1.5 years, 2 years. So just getting the students and the teachers from where they were at the beginning of the pandemic to where we are now was challenging. My role now, so we lost about 35% of our students. We've regained about 20 to 22% of those students or new students. So my role now is to grow the school. And again, I'll be very honest with you. We lost a great deal of money last year, and we're still losing money this year. If I get those 10% back, then we'll be back to making money. So luckily, the school was very well run. The board is very involved. We had, a stack of money set to the side for a rainy day, and the rainy day came, and we're still okay. But my role now is to get us from surviving to actually making money to where we can better resource the school for the students.
Wow. So you're currently head of school, but can you take us right back to the early part of your career? And can you tell us sort of why you decided to become a teacher? And
Sure.
perhaps also just step us through your career progress.
Yeah, I think like many people that I've spoken to in education, that they kind of slipped into the education field. I think I'd always been drawn to education, when I was in high school, simply because I come from a big family. My dad's family is very big. My mom's family is very big. And there were always cousins, aunts, uncles around. So I think I was always drawn to it. But oddly enough, I don't know how aware you are of the education system in the States, but teachers typically don't make very much money. And I was actually advised to go against my initial drawing towards education and go into business. I failed miserably at that. In fact, I think after a couple of months being in quote unquote business school, I had enough and I just dropped out. So I worked for a couple of years trying to figure out what I want to do. And then, I went back to education. So I went back and I got my bachelor's degree in elementary education, a reading specialist as a master's degree. And then when I became, during my master's degree, I decided I was going to take a trip overseas, right? And I did that. I went to Europe. and I just got the travel bug, right? And I came back and I graduated, and I said, I'm going to try international education for a year, see what happens. 27 years, I'm still in international education doing the same thing. So and I've talked to a number of teachers and leaders who have said the same thing, that they were going to try it for a year and they've never gone back, because it's a fantastic job to have, being able to work overseas, work with people from all over the world, being embedded in cultures. It's an amazing lifestyle to be able to have lived for 27 years. And the other part, I would say, is I have 2 children. I think the best gift I've been able to give them is the fact that they have been able to learn in classrooms. There'll be 22 kids in the class from 16 different countries. And so much of the learning took place, yes, within the curriculum that was provided, but also learning from their friends within the classroom. So I look back on that, and that was a great gift that I could give my own children.
We all become global citizens, don't we, when we go into
international? We do. I've been in IB for quite some time, and people throw out the terms global citizens and international mindedness without much thought to it. But if you consider those words and consider the context behind them, it's grandiose for sure, but it's also incredibly important for this world that's growing smaller and smaller day by day.
Absolutely. For me, when I went into international teaching, it was supposed to be 2 years. I took some leave without pay to go overseas, and thought, I'll just come back to my old job. Well, I didn't go back to my old job, and I've been overseas, not for as long as you yet, but I can't see myself going back anytime soon, that's for sure.
So how many years have you been doing this?
Outside of Australia, it's now coming up on 6.5 years. So
goes by fast, doesn't it?
It does. Now, in addition to your current role, you're also part-time adjunct professor at Wilkes University. Can you share what you do in that role?
Yeah, so I've been very fortunate to be involved with Wilkes University. So that's where I received my doctorate degree from. So I was part of the very first cohort from Wilkes out of Pennsylvania, their first international cohort, and that was back. I think they started that back in 2011. And I've been able to stick with them. Been doing some work with them. I teach a few classes. One is at the master's level. It's intercultural communication. And the students in that class basically are in the States. You get a few that might be outside of the States, but they're basically there in Pennsylvania, and they're teachers who are aspiring to be leaders, whether it be a principal or whatever. So that's the clientele for that role. But also, I'm very fortunate to teach a couple of classes at their doctorate level. And those students, the doctorate level, the doctorate that's offered at Wilkes, the education, it's geared towards international educators. So I said I started in 2011. I was teaching overseas in Oman, and that cohort, we had 14 teachers from our school representing, I think there were 6 different countries. So that program, the Wilkes program, has grown and grown over time. So the last course I taught, so I talk about international, it was, there were 8 teachers from 8 different, living in 8 different countries, and they represented, their nationalities were 5 different countries, the States, Canada, there were Egypt, there was Spain, and I can't remember the 5th, but just having those students come together and have those rich conversations about culture, about looking at what we do as leaders to initiate and sustain change within the schools. So even though I was facilitating the class, I get to speak to all these leaders, and they're already leaders, they're already principals, they're already heads of schools. So I get to steal just as much information from them as they take from me. So I think that has been just an incredible professional development experience for me, to being able to interact with all of these educators from all over the world multiple times per year, because I teach that class throughout the year. It's a great experience.
Well, that's interesting because that might give you a really good insight to answer some of the next few questions. Because I wanted to ask you, you've worked in many countries, and of course, you've been now in touch with a lot of people in working in
Mhm.
international schools in different countries. What would you say is the most important and perhaps universal aspect of a successful school community?
Yeah, I think there are a couple points to that, and I think it all begins with the school's guiding statements, the mission and the vision, and the values that the school represents. And I have worked in schools where missions and visions have been nothing more than posters on a wall, and the only time that they get referred to or revisited is when it comes for accreditation, right? Something like that. But if you work in a school who lives up to what their mission and their vision says, because the mission and the vision, you're telling the world what you are as a school and what you value, what you represent. And I think schools should be held responsible for making those day-to-day decisions that reflect what is written in the mission and the vision of school. So I think that's part of it, right? It all falls under that umbrella. And the other part is we talk about success in schools, is you have to hire the right people who reflect that mission and vision,
Mm.
right? It's very difficult if to hire people who don't match that mission and vision, because there's always going to be some, not always toxicity, but there's always going to be some kind of drama that you may have to deal with
Mm.
if those mentalities don't align. And the other part, it's not just with the teachers, um, but when in my schools, I am very explicit that anytime that I have a meeting with the parents, a presentation for the parents, we always start with the mission and vision of the school, because it's
Mm.
that important that every stakeholder be aware what the mission and the vision says. So I think it stems from there. And then when you talk about the day-to-day workings of a school, it's setting up these systems that prepare the school to be successful. For example, I've worked in schools where, for example, we do map testing, right? And the person who's in charge of map testing, it's assigned to their email address, right? Well, in international education, people come and people go. It's a very transient population, but that's what we do. So it's simple, systems that's okay. Instead of setting up with a personal email address, we're going to set it up to a
An
role,
alias.
right?
Yeah.
And it's just sometimes it's as simple as that. But if you haven't been involved in it and you haven't experienced these frustrations, then sometimes you don't think about it. But at the end of the day, when it comes to setting up a community of learners who support each other, parents who support the students, parents who support the school, it all has to be buy-in with that mission and vision.
So the mission and vision sets the scene. But what are some of the similarities and differences, perhaps between schools or
Yeah.
families, students that you've worked at in different parts of the world?
Yeah, I think one universal would be that we have to remember that parents love their children very dearly, and they want what's going to be best for their children. And we have to remind them that the teachers are also the same. We want the best for their children. Sometimes the conversation revolves around what's best, right? The best for the parents is not necessarily the best for the children. But if we have those conversations, if we can have them, because if that, no matter where I've been in the world, this issue has always come up, right? What's going to be best for the students? You have your parent perspective and you have the teacher perspective. The differences, I think the differences that I've seen, it basically boils down to the different embedded culture that each family has. So sometimes there could be nationals who go to the school, right? The local parents, but then you have international parents coming from all over the world. When I was in the Middle East, we had 1,000 students from 70 different nationalities. So it's hard to accommodate every nationality because the culture is so different. So those are some of the differences that we've had to come through. But again, when I learned about the importance of the mission, the vision, it came from Dr. Mona Naismith Smith, who was the head of school there. And there was something that she always spoke about was the mission and vision of the school. It's the common thread that pulls us all together, no matter what nationality that we're from, right? If we can agree on those statements, then that's what holds us together. Is there strife sometime, or is there some misunderstanding? Absolutely. I mean, that's to be expected when you have that many nationalities involved. But for the most part, if you can, as a leader, go back and defend your decisions that you make, and you can attach that to the mission and vision, then I think that's more than the biggest part of the battle.
You touched on this earlier. One of the most challenging aspects of international schools, of course, is the turnover of staff. So, in your experience, how does a school go about not just building but also maintaining that positive school culture when there is such a turnover?
Yeah, so depending on what you read, most people believe that in an international school, 10 to 15% turnover rate per year is okay, right? It's when you get above those numbers that's when you start losing part of that institutional memory of what happens in the school. You start losing a little bit of that. Again, part of it, when I hire teachers, we do talk about the mission and vision of the school, absolutely, but it's also their mentality, right? So I want to make sure that when I hire teachers that they are nice people, right? I've said many times before, I can teach a teacher how to teach, but I can't teach them to be nice people, right? So that's part of it. The other part is setting the school up, looking at this transition, is to make sure that you have a clear idea going into the recruiting season of what you actually need. And then it's also going back and setting up those systems that when people leave, that whoever comes in after that can just step in and take over. If you don't have those systems in place, then many times you have to recreate a system, which makes the school run less efficiently than if that system was already in place. Systems change, they evolve depending on some of the people who you bring in or some of the people who leave. But having those systems in place help to ensure that there is a healthy transition when somebody comes in and when somebody leaves. And that if you have the opportunity to have those transitional meetings between those people who are leaving and the ones coming in, then we try to set those up as well. So it's just looking at trying to make that transition as smooth as possible, because at the end of the day, as we said, if you're in international education, this transition, people coming and people going, is something that you have to deal with just about every single year.
I have to admit, I'm one of those people that contributes to that. I tend to bounce between different schools too far too often. But of course, I had the experience of, I guess, on both sides of being able to experience a really good transition into schools, and hopefully played my part in helping with that transition for the next person. Very vital. I wanted to ask you, what would be one piece of advice you would give to an aspiring school leader who might be thinking about, going down the leadership path?
Yeah, that's if you ask me that question next month, I might have a different answer. It's always changing, right? But I think obviously knowing if you're going to go to a different school, just making sure that you know about that school. But more importantly, if I were, an aspiring leader, I would want to know, what's my leadership style? What do I identify with? Does that style match the school that I'm going in, right? And the other part would be, as just because you're going into a leadership role, don't think that you have to know everything there is about education, because it's impossible. And I think some people, especially when they're new into leadership, they believe that they have to know everything that there is. They believe that they can't say no when somebody asks them a question, which is not the case at all. I also find that people coming into leadership positions, they like policies, right? Because they don't want to make that tough decision on, what's the policy say? What's the policy say? Most of the time when you're in schools, the decisions that you're making day to day don't fall either on the right side or the left side of that policy, there's much more information that needs to be taken into consideration. Speaking of tough conversations, if you don't feel that you're able to have those tough conversations, or if you can't make tough decisions, because the decisions that we have to make, they're not going to please everybody. It's impossible. That if you can't do that now, then that's something that you need to investigate into, is how do you have those conversations? But being able to be very open with your staff, to be vulnerable with your staff, telling them, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'll find out. And I think as a leader, we're obligated to find the answers that we don't know. If we're making decisions, uninformed decisions, then we're putting the school at risk. We're putting the people within the school at risk. So if I don't know the answer to something, I will go to anybody on the staff who I think can help me, and I'll ask them, what do you think about this? But at the end of the day, even when we do that, the decisions that we make are our decisions. No matter the input that we get from other people, we have to take that information, we have to analyze it, and they become our decisions. Because if it's the wrong decision, well, we can't blame somebody else, right? It's our decision. And if it is the wrong decision, you apologize for it and you learn from it, and you don't make that decision again. So it sounds very simple, and it can be, but the information in your head is, you're always analyzing information that's coming from different aspects of the people here in your school. I know that was a long, drawn out answer, but I think that was it's very important that leaders reflect on who they are, because that's going to drive what you do in the future.
It's a really difficult thing to do well, isn't it? Like school leadership, because you've got to, of course, bring people with you, and they've got to respect and understand what you're doing. You've got to be consistent, but you've more importantly got to care, and so that people are perhaps more willing to accept when you make those tough decisions.
That's so true, right? I mean, when you do have that belief in the staff, then when you do make a mistake, and we all will, right? It's what you do with that mistake, right? It's how you learn from it. It's how you make atonement for it. And when you do that over time, and it's perceived as being genuine, which it should be, then that's when you begin to be able to create a community where other people are, they're willing to take a risk, right? Be a risk taker and try something new. If it works, great. If it doesn't, well, okay, it didn't work this time, let's try something else.
Yeah. Michael, what's something that you're currently working on that you're looking forward to, or that excites you?
Yeah, well, it's looking forward to an that's been a transition itself. So this will be, after many years overseas, this will be my last year, at least for a while. I'm going to repatriate back to the States. My kids are there now. They're in school. They're loving what they're doing. So I'm going to be moving from an international educator to a public school, hopefully principal leader in the state of Kansas, of all places. There's a long story behind that, how Kansas came into about that I won't bore you with, but yes, so we're looking at the end of this year, going back to Kansas and seeing what public education looks like. The last time I was in public education, I was in high school, and that was quite a long time ago. So it's going to be interesting to see how it's changed. I can see it from the outside looking in with my own children, but from the inside looking out. So I'm very anxious to see what that does look like.
Well, after you make that transition, it would be really interesting to have you back on the program. Perhaps we could explore, reverse culture shock, if that might be something you experience.
I'm sure that will be something I experience. I've been overseas for quite some time, and I've moved to country, and I've never been as nervous about moving to a new place as I am right now about moving back to the United States. It's very interesting, the process that I've gone through since I've made this decision.
Wow. Well, if people want to get in touch with you, Michael, how can they go about doing that?
Yeah, well, I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter. I can share those details, share them outright. But I'm easily you can easily find me on all of those social media platforms. And I would love to catch up with some people and live vicariously through some of them when I go back to the States and they're still living internationally. That'd be great.
Fantastic. Well, I'll include those links in the description. Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure to catch up. Thanks so much for being on Education Talks.
No, it's been a good experience. I'm glad we got to finally catch up. And when I'm back in Singapore, I look forward to catching up with you face to face.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Michael.
All right. Thank you, David.
If you enjoyed this episode of Education Talks, please do share with your friends and colleagues. Don't forget to stay subscribed to catch each new episode.